That's the focus question. What do we think off the bat of that? How does she preserve and reinvent? Obviously, that means how and why. To what extent does she do it? You need to say how and why. What do you think is preserved? Let's just hear very, very broad answers here. So you probably don't, this is a key point with a question like this. Don't generalize things like characters are preserved. It's like, well, parts of characters are preserved, but actually I'd say the characters are mainly reinvented. So what is preserved? You have to actually pick the thing that is preserved the most. So be careful what you focus on as that point. So you see, so form's not preserved. Characters, I would probably argue, are better on the reinvent side. Some of the core concepts are preserved, like the obsession with control. But the particular perspective represented about that is reinvented. So you've got to be careful saying that anything is completely preserved, because my argument would be nothing is completely preserved. When you talk about each thing, there is partial preservation and partial reinvention. So it's not like particular things as a whole are preserved ever. So everything has some preservation and some reinvention. So you actually would need to address the different parts that way. So even though Atwood preserves that obsession with control, the manifestation of that control is reinvented. Because on the one hand, it's a kind of physical control, it's a control using magic, right? Which relates to that kind of supernatural, religious context. And then you have the psychological form of control, Miranda. Because he tries to summon her as a figment of his imagination. Does everyone remember that core element of Hag-seed? Because he can't let her go. So I would actually argue that Felix is controlled by Miranda there, because her memory is actually imprisoned in him. It's an emotional imprisonment, right? When you get a question like this, where you're going to argue a bit of both, right? So obviously she preserves a little bit, reinvents a little bit. The key words you want to use in the intro and the way you address that are whilst, the word whilst, and whereas, right? So the way you actually frame that in a sentence is whilst Atwood preserves, then say the part that she's preserving, you know, Prospero's obsession with control or Prospero's sense of imprisonment, she reinvents, like that's a comma there, she reinvents the mode of that imprisonment as it goes from physical to emotional. You could say she preserves aspects of Prospero's character. I would say she actually reinvents that character in a more what light. So he's actually more humanized. So there is a more favorable representation. See how the key word of the question is representation? I would say there's a more favorable representation of Felix because she reinvents his context. So the tragic loss of his daughter Miranda didn't happen in the Tempest. So that's an example. That's not the only way she humanizes him, of course, but that kind of reimagining of the plot means that she's able to reinvent the character. Even though he's still the same character who wants revenge, she's reinvented the motivation for that because he's trying to revive his daughter Miranda, which Prospero wasn't trying to do, and therefore he comes off more human. It's a more humanized representation of him.